the longest tenured master water specialist and certified installer by the WQA in the USA. He's the president of US Water Systems, which is a family-owned business where their world headquarters is in Indianapolis. They're the largest supplier of water treatment systems for craft beer brewing in the US and count many of the larger craft breweries as their clients. He is also on the board of the Gift of Water, which is an Indiana-based nonprofit that provides water treatment in Haiti. Providing water for craft beer brewing is a niche that US Water Systems has been involved in for over 10 years. He also adds that while he doesn't know how to brew beer, he is accomplished at drinking it, and he does know how to make water to brew beer. Without any further ado, here's Mark Timmons. Thank you.
Well, that introduction makes me sound like I'm old. Guess I am. But I've learned a thing or two in that period of time. The title of this is 5 Reasons You Should Not Use Reverse Osmosis in Your Craft Beer Brewery. And first of all, let me put a disclaimer here. This is not a presentation on why you don't want to use reverse osmosis, because we are proponents of reverse osmosis. But there are occasions where you don't need reverse osmosis. And so we're going to talk about a number of water treatment methods, applications, and why you may or may not want to apply reverse osmosis in your craft beer brewery. I'll tell you a story. About 16, 17 years ago, I don't remember exactly, but it was sometime in the early 2000s when craft beer just started taking off. There was breweries popping up all over the country, and there were a few chains that were even trying to get into craft beer brewing. And I remember going to one in another city out west, and I'm not going to name the city because I want the company to remain anonymous for obvious reasons. I had a buddy of mine that was there. We were at a convention, and he said, let's go to this brewery. And so we went there, and we had some food, but the beer was outstanding. It was just fabulous. And I remembered that. And then a few months later, I was in another city at another convention, and the same brewery was located in that city. And I thought, man, this is great. So I had some buddies with me. I said, let's go to this brewery. And so we go there. We'll call that Brewery B. And beer just wasn't quite as good. It was still good. I'm not saying I sent it back, but it wasn't quite as good as the first one. So I didn't really think much about it. And then maybe a year later, I don't recall the time frame exactly, but I was at the same brewery located in the Midwest and went there excitedly to get some beer. And when I got the beer, it wasn't even close to the beer that I had at Brewery A. Brewery C was not nearly as good. Well, being inquisitive about it, I knew where the other two were located, and I knew that they were located in areas where the water was not highly mineralized. I also knew the water was, those cities that they were in, the water was quite frequently recognized as being very good water. So I tested the water, and I knew what the problem was. And I contacted the brewery, telling them, look, I can solve your problem. I can make it so you can make good beer again. And they weren't very happy to see me. They didn't want to talk about it. Well, sadly, that beer brewery's model hasn't really worked very well. They're still in business, but they've closed a number of locations. And I think they still struggle with water treatment. And so not everybody uses reverse osmosis. I would say about 5 or 6 years ago, reverse osmosis was probably 20% of what we sold to craft beer brewers. And over the years, it's evolved to now it's over 50%. It might be 60%. We've got a craft beer brewer on staff that we brought about a year ago, Ian, who some of you know, who has about 10 years experience in brewing here in Indianapolis. And it's been an immense help having a brewer on staff because, we know how to treat the water, but he speaks brew speak. He speaks stuff that you guys talk about all the time. And it's been real helpful. Would you say it's 60%, Ian, or is it higher than that?
I'd say closer to 75 probably.
Okay, well, I don't exaggerate too much then. So it's becoming more and more popular, but again, it's not for everyone. And we're going to talk about today who it might be for and who it might not be for. And we're going to talk about it. Beer has one common ingredient. Whatever beer you're making, you're using the same ingredient that everybody else is. And that's what? Water. Beer is 90 to 95% water. And so water these days is a lot different than it was maybe 50 years ago. There's more contaminants. There's more problems with the water. Our infrastructures are aging. Cities are not able to accomplish the water treatment like they'd like to because of burgeoning populations, more contaminants, and so they choose to treat it in different methods, in different ways. We have things like chlorine, iron, manganese, chloramines, tannin, nitrates, TDS, sodium chloride, sulfates, and many other elements in the water are not always desirable for brewing beer, or at certain concentrations are not desirable for brewing beer. So what's the best method for treating water to brew beer? Well, the answer really is, it depends. And let's look at our first slide here. Even though beer is 90 to 95% water, depends on where you're geographically located, whether you have city or well water, whether your water source uses chloramine, chlorine, or whatever, and what type of beer you want to brew. All those come into play. It's very difficult to overstate, let me emphasize that again. It's very difficult to overstate the importance of water quality in the making of a good craft brew beer. Water is literally the lifeblood of the product. And apart from its direct role as an ingredient in brewing beer, water naturally conforms to the character of the remaining elements used in the beer brewing. Now, let's look at and elaborate on some of these factors. Let's go to the next slide and look at a geographic location. Here is a water profile that I pulled off the Internet Water Report from Louisville, Kentucky. Anybody ever drink beer in Louisville? It's usually pretty good. Depends on the brewery. Look at some of the things, the contaminants that are in the water. Alkalinity, pH, fluoride, calcium, magnesium, sodium, sulfate, bicarbonate, chloride, hardness. Pretty low in hardness, pretty low in sulfates and chlorides, sodium, magnesium. May not be exactly the recipe that you want, but none of those are extreme. Okay? Let's compare that to, say, Westfield. Any brewers here in Westfield?
I live there.
Okay.
It sucks.
Got rainwater.
It's horrible.
So Westfield, look at the difference here. Look at the levels of alkalinity. Look at the pH, it's different. Fluoride, calcium, magnesium, sodium, sulfate, chloride, bicarbonate, and hardness. Quite a bit different profile. If you're trying to brew the same beer with raw water in Louisville versus Westfield, I'm going to submit to you, you're going to have some issues. You're not going to be able to produce the same water if you have two breweries in that same city without some proper water treatment. But that's not the only problem. So the water varies from Louisville to Westfield to Denver to Portland to New York City, which has some of the finest water around, by the way. Not only does it vary from parts of the city or country, but it also varies in the same city. Let's go to the next slide. Look at, this is from Westfield, and I looked at their water reports, and the fluoride can vary from 0.7 to 1.5. And that's very detrimental to beer brewing. The chloride can vary from 24 to 45. The chlorine residual can be 0.26 or 2.2 parts per million. It's about what a swimming pool is. The hardness varies from 303 to 486, That's a huge, huge swing. The iron varies from non-detectable to 0.4. 0.3 is where iron starts staining. So 0.4 is an area that's going to create some concern. The manganese varies from non-detectable to 0.04, and manganese stains at 0.05 parts per million. Sodium varies from 63 to 31, and the sulfate varies from 69 to 190. I'm going to submit to you that if you're brewing beer in Westfield, Indiana, your beer is not going to be consistent from day to day if you're just using filtration.
What, is that seasonal
Yes.
variables, or is that at any given time?
It can vary as far as 2 weeks apart can be that dramatic. But a lot of it's seasonal. So early spring to whenever, let's say when the weather really warms up, we can see some of it then too. So it is, but it does vary that much, and it can be dramatic from week to week. And by the way, if any of you have any questions, and that was a perfect question, and the timing was perfect. If any of you have any questions, write them down, and Ian and I, because he's smarter than me, is going to answer the questions that you guys submit. So we're going to have a Q&A at the end. I like to say that beer is 90% water and 10% magic, or art, or whatever you want to call it. The water's a given, but you guys do your magic with the other stuff that you put in, with the malt, the hops, barley, yeast, whatever it happens to be. And that's where a true beer artist comes in. However, if you're just relying on the city to be your source of water, I'm going to submit that you're being held hostage by that city as to what quality your brew is going to be. Depending upon your TDS level and what type of beer you're trying to brew, you might be led to choose different technologies to treat your water. For instance, if your TDS is below 250, maybe you decide you don't want reverse osmosis. Maybe you're going to use micron filtration and carbon filtration, and we'll talk about that more later, but you may decide you want to use micron filtration and carbon filtration. And you want to think about disinfection too. It's a beverage. You're making this for the public, so you want to think about some type of disinfection for that water. There are exceptional beers that are brewed with both high and low TDS water, but the TDS levels cannot just be considered in a vacuum. pH and other contaminants also need to be considered in addition to the TDS level. Consider this, RO removes about 97% of sodium nitrate from the water. Nitrates reduce to nitrites in solution, which then are toxic to yeast, as you well know. Also, pH in conjunction with TDS levels have to be considered, as mash pH is very critical, as you well know. How many brewers are here? How many are brewers? Keep your hands up. How many get your water from city water? So I only see a couple go down. So most of you are depending upon your municipality or surface water or well waters as a result. How you're going to treat that water varies depending upon where your water source is. So a water test is paramount unless you've got a good city water test. We always urge brewers, look, I mean, if you're going in and spending thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, you can spend $100 to $200 and get a good water test, because that's going to be 90% of the product that you're brewing. I see so many brewers who don't want to spend that $200 or $119. It's very important to get a good water analysis so that we can know exactly what the profile of that water is, and we can treat it. And we can help you decide what kind of regimen you want to do on that treatment. Total alkalinity, bicarbonate, and other contaminant levels will also affect the brewing process. Does everybody know what chloramine is? Does everybody understand how it's made? I mean, we know years ago they used chlorine, only exclusively. And then lately, more and more cities are using chloramine. Chloramine is formed by adding ammonia to chlorine. Sounds like an extra step. Why do they do that? Well, chloramine is almost impossible to destroy. It's like chlorine on steroids. It's like the Energizer Bunny. It keeps going and going and going. You know, you can boil water and you can boil the chlorine out of it. You can dissipate most of the chlorine. Chlorine's a whole other story. You can boil it and boil it and boil it and stay it in there. To get chlorine out, granular activated carbon is generally the way that is accepted to do that, unless you're talking about billions of gallons or millions of gallons, and then there's other chemical processes that we can do. But in a typical craft beer brewery, most of the water has the chlorine removed by granular activated carbon. Now there's two types of granular activated carbon. One is coconut shell based and the other one is coal based. We recommend coconut shell based because I found that a coconut shell based carbon has a little bit more capacity for chlorine, but it also imparts a little bit sweeter taste to the water that you're drinking. And you know, I've always heard if the water tastes good, the beer's probably going to taste good. Again, some of you may disagree and say, well, I want to use coal-based. And maybe you have a recipe that is conducive to that. I certainly would not argue with that. You know, a lot of this stuff is totally subjective, but over the years, I've typically found that using coconut shell-based granular activated carbon is the best way to do it. Now, maybe you say, well, my city doesn't use chloramine. And maybe they don't today, but they very well might tomorrow because it's cheaper. Even though you're adding ammonia, it doesn't dissipate. It stays in the lines until the point of distribution. And so over time, it becomes a lot more economical for the city. If the city can save money, believe me, if they haven't figured out how they're going to do it yet, they're going to do it tomorrow. So I always advise people, if you're putting in a craft beer brewery, put a granular activated carbon filter, a GAC, and also put a catalytic carbon filter. The reason you need a catalytic carbon filter is to remove the chloramine. If you just rely on catalytic carbon itself to remove the chloramine, the chlorine component will eat up the catalytic carbon very, very quickly. Catalytic carbon, and we use coconut shell catalytic carbon, but you can also use coal-based. Catalytic carbon has a great affinity for the ammonia and the chlorine. But if you don't take out the chlorine first, you will dramatically cut the life of that catalytic carbon by as much as 70%. So in our best systems, sometimes people don't, it's a question of, do I have enough money to do it? If we have two tanks of carbon, one granular activated carbon and one catalytic carbon, obviously it's going to be more expensive than one tank. Sometimes we'll compromise and we'll mix a tank 50-50, but it doesn't mix perfectly, so things don't actually happen in sequence. So the best craft beer breweries, in my opinion, are going to use catalytic carbon and granular activated carbon. Now I'm talking about a tank, a vessel that literally holds cubic feet of carbon, and depending on how much you need depends on how much water you're going to use and how fast you're going to use it. Some people try to use cartridges, and cartridges, while being effective at removing chlorine, not so much chloramine, don't have much capacity. 20,000 gallons and they're spent. And if you do the math, you're going to find that that's pretty expensive. 1 cubic foot of carbon costs retail about $100. A carbon block filter costs maybe $30-40. But you have to realize a carbon block filter has like 1/15 of the amount of carbon that a cubic foot of carbon has. So it's not real cost effective to do it that way. So we're always advising people, if you don't have chloramine today, be prepared, because one of these days your city's going to have chloramine, and if you don't get that out of your water, it's really going to play with your beer. I promise you it's not going to be a pretty thing. If you're brewing a stout or an IPA or a lager, you will likely need different levels of contaminants or brewing salts, whatever you want to call it. Because pH, bicarbonate alkalinity, TDS, all vary. A lot of brewers are pretty secretive about this. I've got some good friends that are brewers, and they have a mixture that they aren't going to share with you. And you may be the same way. That's your stock in trade. That's your secret. That's how you make the best beer. We're not going to tell you how to brew beer. Well, Ian might, I don't know. But we're going to tell you how to treat the water to get the best beer. That's what we're going to tell you. And RO is one of the few ways that you can break down the water. You can take everything out of it, and then you can put back in what levels you want at a controlled fashion, at a controlled rate, so that you're not at the mercy of the city who's doing this. They don't care when you're brewing beer. They're going to add this stuff to the water regardless, depending upon the season, like was mentioned earlier. Again, there's no pat answer as to what you're going to do in water treatment. In some cases, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to use a sediment filter, typically 5 to 1 microns, or if you want, you can go down even smaller. A lot of times we go to 0.5 micron because cysts are removed with 0.5 micron. Then a granular activated carbon filter, and then something for disinfection like ultraviolet or some other method. And there are other methods that we'll be talking about. The first method that, like I say, all breweries should be considering is micron filtration. And this is where you filter out the fish, turtles, frogs, things like that. Sticks and stones really don't have much of a place in craft beer brewing, so it's a good idea to get all that out from the city or the well. As I said, 1 micron is great, 5 micron is adequate, 0.5 is even better. And sometimes what we do is a step down filtration. We may start with a 5, a 1, and then go down to 0.5 micron, depending upon what type of filters you're using. Cartridge filters, everybody calls them the big blue filters. Everybody's seen those. Those are 1 inch. A lot of times for the average brewery, those are fine if you start with maybe a 5, a 1, and a 0.5 micron. We happen to make a big blue, well, it's actually a big gray filter, and ours are made in USA. The big blue ones, the reason they're blue is they're made in China, that's what it means. So that's one of the things you'll notice about us, US Water. We try to make most of our equipment in USA. We're one of the few manufacturers that has cartridge filters manufactured in the USA. RO systems, softeners, everything that we have is made in the USA. Also, backwashing sediment filters. These are typically a tank. It can be as small as a 9 by 48 tank, or it could be a 24 by 72 inch tank, or even bigger, depending upon the water quality. These have a media called, it's mined zeolite. Some companies use different names for it, but it's the same stuff. It's, we call it Filter Ag Plus. It filters down to below 5 microns, and it traps the sediment in the tank, and then it backwashes periodically, maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks. Depends on how turbid your water is. If your water is pretty clean, then maybe you just need a cartridge filter to protect the system, to keep, you know, all those fish and turtles and big stuff out of the water. Larger breweries use what we call large format filters. These are filters that may be 1.5 or 2 inch, or even up to 6 or 8 inch. They're stainless steel housings that have multi-filter elements inside that can flow up to 1,200 gallons a minute. So I doubt if anybody in here has a brewery that size, but recently toured the Blue Moon Brewery out in Denver, and they had those kind of filters. So it was kind of interesting to see those. I mentioned earlier about disinfection, and I think it's incumbent upon the average craft beer brewer to have some type of disinfection. I think it's a responsibility you should take seriously. If nothing else except to protect yourself. Let's just say someone gets a bacterial infection and dies. And maybe it doesn't come from your brewery, but maybe they think it did. If you have taken some measure to protect yourself and your customers by having some type of disinfection system there, I think it could save you a lot in the long run. And it shows that you're being proactive in providing a good product for your customers. So think about some type of disinfection. What are the types of disinfection? Well, used to be chlorine was used. I don't think chlorine is an ideal situation for the average craft brewer because it requires at least 20 minutes contact time, it requires tanks, and then the disinfection byproducts that you make where you have to take the chlorine back out just doesn't make sense to me. Over the years in the industry, ultraviolet has kind of become the industry standard. Ultraviolet light, whereas you pass a water through a stainless steel vessel that has an ultraviolet light down the center, surrounded with a quartz sleeve. It produces light at 256 nanometers, that kills bacteria. It interrupts their DNA and ceases to exist. And then there's some new technologies. One of them is called quantum disinfection, and it's very much like the way they make semiconductors. You start with a ceramic substrate, looks like a little media, like a little resin bead or a carbon bead. It's made out of ceramic, and it's got titanium oxide and silver vapor deposed upon the surface of it. It's hungry for electrons, and as water passes through a cartridge of this, any microorganism that touches this instantly is relieved of its electrons. It causes the cell wall to collapse, and it ceases to exist on a subatomic level. It adds nothing to the water, it doesn't require electricity, it doesn't require power of any sort, and it's very effective. And more people are starting to use quantum disinfection. There's another method called charged membrane, which it's literally a membrane that looks like a sheet of paper almost, but it's embedded with bohemite. And it has a zeta charge of plus 51. It attracts bacteria, cysts, virus, things like that. They stick, they can't get out. It also takes out things like tannin, lead, chromium-6, arsenic, and other things too. So there's some really cool technology that's coming down the pipe for this type of application. Still, in most applications, tried and true is ultraviolet, and we use ultraviolet quite frequently. Occasionally we have some brewers, beverage people ask, well, do you have something other than UV, and we use quantum disinfection for that. Ozone is something that is popular in the beverage industry, but I don't think it's really something that's considered in craft beer brewing, although a number of brewers are using ozone for cleaning. They have ozone generators that they can clean out their tanks. The nice thing about ozone is it works best, it mixes best in cold water, so you don't have to use hot water to clean your tanks, and it's an excellent disinfectant. We're working on some systems right now that are going to incorporate ozone for cleaning, but not for processing the beer. We talked about carbon filtration and the importance of using proper carbon, catalytic carbon, granular activated carbon. Water softening is another thing that some breweries have, but most of these breweries that have water softeners do not use water softeners for brewing beer. They use it for their kitchens, for their water heaters, things like that. But they don't use it in the product. Most of the time they're using reverse osmosis, which, originally reverse osmosis was discovered back in the 1700s, but it was about 200 years later that it was really commercialized, and it was commercialized as a way to desalinate seawater. So to this day, one of the easiest things for reverse osmosis to remove is sodium. And so a water softener adds sodium to the water. It's very easy for the reverse osmosis system to take out that sodium. And so the people that use whole building reverse osmosis usually are taking it back out with whole house softening, whole building softening, or taking it out with reverse osmosis. In most cases these days, instead of using a water softener, we use an anti-scalant. We inject an anti-scalant ahead of the RO system that prevents scale on the membrane, but the anti-scalant itself is rejected by the membrane and flushed down the drain. You don't have to haul bags of salt, but in this part of the country, if you don't use an anti-scalant or an RO, you're going to scale your membranes very, very quickly, like in a matter of days or weeks, and it gets pretty expensive to do that. Use an anti-scalant or a water softener, membranes sometimes last 5, 6, 7 years, and that's a big expense. Anyone here on well water? Well, then I'll go through this quick. Well water, typically, the problems in Indiana are iron, sulfur, and manganese. You don't buy filters to take those out in the truest sense, like a cartridge filter or anything like that. To take those out requires oxidation. You're going to have to oxidize those things, and you do that with either chlorine, hydrogen peroxide, ozone, potassium permanganate, something like that. Our preference is hydrogen peroxide because it produces no disinfection byproducts. It totally oxidizes the iron and sulfur. If you ever smelled the rotten egg odor, you certainly wouldn't want that in your beer. And gets rid of all the manganese. So, since nobody has a well water system here, we won't dwell on that today. We're going to skip the whole thing on hydrogen peroxide. It's really not surprising then that more and more breweries are shifting to reverse osmosis for their craft brew water. Now, some people say, well, isn't reverse osmosis wasteful? Well, it does waste some water. Used to be that for every gallon they made, they'd waste 6 gallons. That's about 15% efficiency. Now it's just the opposite. Our most efficient systems waste 1 gallon for every 4 gallons they make. Now, some people really want to be green and they say, well, I don't want to waste any water. And I reply, well, you know how many gallons of water goes to making a pair of jeans? 1,700. If you truly don't want to be a hypocrite, I suggest you go naked. You know, wasting water, I don't look at it as wasting water, you're purifying water. If you want to capture, if you're making 800 gallons of water to brew beer and you're wasting 200, if you're really, truly green, you can capture that water and use it for flushing toilets, whatever. You can have a gray water system. So you don't really waste it. I mean, when you wash your dishes, you maybe waste 10 or 15 gallons in your dishwasher. Wash clothes, same thing. You take a shower, it's not wasting water. These are things we need to do. Now, we can minimize the effect of that, and our new systems are very efficient at not wasting water. As you know, reverse osmosis is a natural process where two liquids, when they're side by side with a membrane in there, one's going to, the higher dilution is going to go to the weaker dilution. In this case, we're just applying pressure to it to create reverse osmosis. What makes up a complete reverse osmosis system? You know, we have some people that they try to go and buy just an RO module. And there's a lot more to it than just the RO module. People say, well, what's the best reverse osmosis system I can buy? And my suggestion is the best reverse osmosis system on the market is the one with the best pre-treatment. I can take the best reverse osmosis system on the market and it might fail in 2 weeks without proper pre-treatment. And I can take the worst one, it might work for 3 years with proper pre-treatment. So pre-treatment is paramount. Pre-treatment means sediment filtration, carbon filtration, catalytic carbon filtration, anti-scalant, softening, whatever you happen to choose. And then storage and distribution are 2 things. You know, RO systems typically produce water very slowly, so you need a tank. I mean, we provide RO systems that make from 1,000 gallons a day to 1,000,000 gallons a day. I mean, anything you want. But you have to have storage and distribution, and then you have to have some type of disinfection after that distribution tank because you can have airborne bacteria in that tank. And the post-treatment could include that ultraviolet, sometimes remineralization. I had a guy talking to me yesterday, he says, I don't like to mix all that stuff. Can you set it up so that I can have a series of pumps and I can inject whatever I want back in the water? Absolutely. We have blending panels that you can dial in whatever TDS you want to brew with. You can take RO water and blend filtered, carbon filtered and sediment filtered tap water together to get your desired TDS. If An RO is typically going to strip the water down to below 10, sometimes 5 parts per million. If you want to brew at 37, like Brooklyn City water is, you can just dial it right in and you can get 37 if that's what you want. And then instrumentation. We've got the instrumentation if you want to monitor pH, you want to monitor chlorine, you want to monitor TDS or conductivity. Those are all things that we could easily do. So, I'm getting done, and you're glad. I'm going to give you the 5 reasons you should not use reverse osmosis in your craft beer brewery. Number 1 is you live in an area where your water is naturally low in TDS. It's a no-brainer. I mean, Bloomington, one of the few cities in Indiana. Anybody here from Bloomington? You probably don't need anything but carbon filtration and micron filtration. I mean, you could put a RO in, but it would be redundant. It really doesn't accomplish much for you. There's another reason you might not want to. You don't have the money. And you know, I mean, let's face it, it's always about the money to some degree. It's always about the money. And you know, maybe you've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, whatever it is, but maybe you're starting on a shoestring. And you know, I mean, we started our company on a shoestring. My wife and I started our company 18 years ago in our garage. And now we've grown to worldwide, and we've got almost 40 employees. We started in our garage. We certainly didn't have the money to buy everything that we needed in the beginning. And so there's nothing wrong with not having the money. So maybe you can start with some type of carbon filtration and micron filtration with the idea that you're going to grow into it. And there's nothing wrong with that. So not having the money is a good reason. Third reason is you don't have the space. And that's a valid reason if you truly don't have the space. But we just ran into a company that we supplied water treatment, I don't know, a year or 2 ago, Big Lug Brewery in Broad Ripple, and they put carbon filtration and micron filtration in when they installed it. And they said they didn't have room for an RO. That's why they didn't do an RO. Well, we went and looked at their application, and guess what? They had plenty of room for an RO system. And if you guys haven't had a chance, you might look at one of our videos where Scott, the brewer there, is talking about the change that ROs made in their water and the way they brew beer. The fourth reason is you may make some kind of beer that tastes best with highly mineralized water. And I'm not sure what that is because I'm not a craft beer brewer, but I suppose it's possible, and I'm sure that maybe your recipe is you want high TDS, and so fine, you don't want RO. The last reason I don't think applies because I don't think you people would be here, but the last reason is you really don't care how your beer tastes. And I think everybody here does, or you wouldn't even be listening to this. I think you're all artists and you take pride in what you do. And so just a little bit of what we do. We sell water treatment systems for craft breweries all over the country, all over the world. Next month, this is the first show we've ever done. We've been growing into this. It's the first show we've ever done. In April, we're going to do the CBC conference out in Denver and exhibiting there. This was a trial run for our booth, setting up our booth. We'll enhance it a little bit more and do a little bit better than we did here. And like I said though, it's really changing. The industry is changing. 5 years ago, it wasn't nearly as much reverse osmosis as it is now. Sodium is a problem. I think you all know that. And that's why smart brewers never use softened water usually. It's almost a good idea to keep sodium levels below 50 milligrams per liter. Carbonate, bicarbonate can be desirable at certain levels, but higher levels, maybe not so desirable. Darker beers with high acidity sometimes have 300 milligrams of carbonate, while IPAs may want under 30 or 40. So you see what I'm saying? It just varies depending upon what your beer recipe is. And as I mentioned earlier, iron, sulfur, and manganese almost are never good when it comes to brewing beer. And of course, you just don't want to have to chew your beer. You know, fish and turtles You don't want to keep that in the water. Sticks and stones, sediment, sand, silt, those things are never desirable. And as I mentioned earlier, disinfection of your water is paramount. I think it's responsible to want to disinfect your water somehow, maybe if only to cover your ass, so to speak. So, in conclusion, before we answer any questions, I'm just going to say that you need to remember this. I'd like to think that I dreamed this up, but maybe somebody else did before me. They always say water is life, but beer is 90% water, so therefore beer is life. And thank you very much for your time, and if you have any questions, Ian and I will be happy to answer them. Go ahead, whoever.
When you talk about the anti-scalant injection systems compared to pre-softener, what's the ballpark? I mean, assuming you're treating the same amount of volume, and I assume you save money in terms of not bringing salt in the upfront cost on installation of that versus.
It's usually about half the price of a water softener, or on bigger systems it might be a quarter of the price. You've got an ongoing cost of the anti-scalant, which is typically very small compared to salt. It's smaller than salt. You don't have any waste, you know, and you don't have resin to replace and things like that. It's actually our preferred method. We use it on laboratory water. A big emerging industry that we're growing into now is cannabis, and we use it for that too, and as well as water for brewing beer. So anti-scalant, I mean, I was very resistant because I'm an old plumber. I mean, I liked copper plumbing. It took me a long time to get over that. Go into the plastic plumbing. I wouldn't do anything but PEX anymore. I was an old water softener guy. You know, we're going to put a water softener in no matter what. Honestly, my choice is to use the anti-scalant.
And it's 100% rejected by the RO?
Yes, it's NSF certified too. So it's not anything that's going to be in your water stream. We use them in labs where the water's got to be absolutely perfectly clear.
Thank you.
Another one?
So when we redid our building, our builder was told that we carbon filter our water. Our builder was told the carbon filter doesn't need to be plugged into work. A couple of years later, we're reviewing our system because we're having a lot of issues with all of our dishwashers and everything because of hardness. Same company, person out there reviewing our system says, oh no, you have to plug in the carbon filter for it to work. Who's right?
Well, there's probably the person that said you didn't have to plug it in was closer to right. Carbon filters don't have to be backwashed very often unless you've got some incredibly bad water. You can't backwash anything out of the carbon. You can only backwash things that have accumulated between the carbon areas. The carbon absorbs chemicals, so it can't be backwashed. But it also traps, it tends to act as a sediment filter with a bed of carbon, and it's going to trap a lot of sediment, sand, things like that. So, as a matter of fact, the longer that you can go between backwashing, the better it's going to filter, because when you backwash it, you kind of break things loose. And it makes a filter flock almost that becomes good to filtering out things. So, if you got a backwashing carbon filter, I'd at least backwash it once a month. I wouldn't say never, but it's not as important as you might think.
Thanks.
I see another one back there.
You talked about a micron filtration on your incoming water. To what micron does most municipalities provide that already filtered? Shouldn't that already be filtered for the fish and turtles and the big stuff you were talking about?
It should be, I agree with that.
Yeah, so.
Has the government ever let us down before? You know,
So,
I mean,
what's the average municipality trying to filter to on a micron level?
well, it's hard to see anything under 10 microns with the naked eye. Okay? So sometimes in certain cities at certain times, you can see sediment in the water. I mean, maybe if they've been out flushing the hydrants or anything, you'll see some visible sediment in the water, maybe some discoloration. I just suggest 5. 1 is even better because you're just taking out more things, but you're protecting the system. It's kind of like, I use this analogy. If you went and changed the oil on your car and plugged up your oil filter so it wouldn't work and just bypassed the oil filter, your car would probably run for quite a while. But eventually, there's stuff that's created in the engine that's going to be detrimental to that. An oil filter protects the engine of a car. A water filter is more for protection of downstream equipment, including brewing equipment, than it is anything. And, you know, I could get into a long diatribe about our aging infrastructures. You know, are we to assume that the city is to supply water to us that is to be consumed, when 95% of the water that the city supplies, that's actually closer to 98%, 98% of the water that a city supplies is not consumed internally? Are we to assume that 98% of it is to be treated as if it's going to be consumed internally? Because if we continue to subscribe to that theory, we're going to find that our water bills are going to go up 400% or 500% in order to upgrade these aging infrastructures. I mean, when you count firefighting, when you count manufacturing, when you count bathing, flushing toilets, 98% of the water is not intended for consumption. And so I don't think moving forward it's economically feasible for the cities to continue to treat water like that. Just my opinion.
And kind of piggybacking on that, I'll always recommend at least like a 5 micron filter, even on city water. I mean, just in case something, like God forbid, like a water main should break and you start pulling like old galvanized plumbing into your brew house pump and stuff, that would be a pretty bad time. You don't want to do that. So, you know, it's kind of a just in case sort of thing.
Right, and you never know when something like that.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
It's a safeguard.
It's insurance policy. It's like, you know, if you're sure your house isn't going to burn down, you probably wouldn't cover it. But we can never be sure. And this is just an insurance policy to protect your equipment investment.
You also stressed the post-disinfection of the water. I mean, our water eventually is going to go through a boiling process, but are you concerned with bacteria building up in the RO tank, or?
I mean, you can get atmospheric bacteria. I mean, there's no such thing as taking out 100% of bacteria, and I know it's going to get boiled out. It's just, and I have some brewers argue about that, say, well, I'm going to boil it out, I don't need it. I'm going to submit to you, if somebody ever gets sick in your brewery and they come back on your brewery, if you've got a UV there, you've at least taken steps to prevent that. If you say, well, it's going to boil it out, yeah, it probably will. You sure it boils? You know, it's just, again, I'm not saying you got to do it that way. I'm just saying if it were me, I always look at things, if it were me, what would I do? And, you know, if it were me, that's what I would do.
I mean, there's people doing high gravity brewing that are adding water back in post boil, where it's a must, right? But yeah, I wasn't sure on why you were doing it.
Again, I went through the Blue Moon Brewery and they have no disinfection. But the water in Denver is a lot different than the water here. So there's no right answer. You know, I'm just always looking at all the possibilities.
I mean, I guess another possibility would be, you know, a lot of guys that if they end up getting an RO system and they want to just fill, you know, they want to forego like a ballast tank or something, they want to just fill like a cold liquor tank or hot liquor tank directly. If you're filling your cold liquor tank directly, you use that water to knock out, let's say you've got gaskets that are wearing down in your heat exchanger and you're going to start getting leaks in your process or something, you know, and you've got bacteria, eutrophic bacteria growing in that cold liquor tank because it's not getting soaked or something often enough. I mean, that's just one more potential possibility, but again, like you said, I mean, typically in the process, you know, hopefully you're going to boil your wort. So, you know, just food for thought, I guess.
You know, heterotrophic bacteria exist everywhere in nature. And heterotrophic bacteria, unlike pathogenic bacteria, is not bad for you. At least it's not bad for most people. But the people that can't tolerate heterotrophic bacteria are the elderly the immune compromised and infants, and I doubt if you're serving many infants your beer, but that's always an issue too. Elderly and immune compromised people cannot tolerate heterotrophic bacteria. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'll fall before here, but chlorine versus chloramines. I've been told that some municipalities use chloramines occasionally, and it's not just a full-sale switch from chlorine to chloramines, but they occasionally will use chloramines to kind of, because it's got a longer shelf life, and it kind of helps clean the pipes and stuff, so occasionally you might use chloramines. But as a brewer, you never know when they're using chlorine versus chloramines, and if they've switched and suddenly they're using chloramines, is your regular filtration system going to take care of those? And how do you know? And so what is the usage of chloramines versus chlorine? Is that true? We just don't know. Or are most people doing a full-sale switch to go from chlorine to chloramines?
No, they do go back and forth. They do go back, you're exactly right.
So it does go back.
Yeah, they do go back and forth, which actually makes the case as to why you want to have two carbon tanks. You want to have a granular activated carbon tank followed by the catalytic carbon tank. Because when they're just using chloramines, you know, the catalytic carbon tank, the granular activated carbon tank, which is first, will take out some of the chlorine, but the second tank gets it all. But if you just had catalytic carbon or granular activated carbon, you're not going to take out the chloramine with granular activated carbon, and if you have just catalytic carbon, you're going to spin that carbon very, very quickly, like 10 times faster than if you have the two-step process. So that's exactly why I recommend having two tanks.
Are there corrosion considerations, cold liquor tank, hot liquor tank, with using RO water?
As long as they're stainless, typically not.
No, there's no problems with that, but there are sure problems. I mean, I was talking to guys yesterday that say they have to scrape the lime scale out of their I guess their hot liquor tank. So yeah, there's no corrosion problem with stainless steel.
Back to the anti-scalant, is that system fine for piping and boiler type system, or would you want to avoid that and treat your boiler with just city water? Right now if we're using a softener right now for a boiler, you're getting rid of the softener. You then go to just a chemical treatment on both, but they're separate, or what? What do you usually do in that case? We
really don't do boiler treatment, but I can tell you if you're using a softener on your boiler, you should probably keep using a softener. Some places use RO on their boiler.
The RO is going to eat the metal, right? I mean,
well, they use an inhibitor. The people that do the boilers typically use an inhibitor in the boiler.
Okay.
So you should talk to your boiler manufacturer, your chemical guy that's doing that. We don't specialize in that, but I can tell you that on high pressure boilers like the utilities use, they use straight RO water. One more?
Just to clarify, on the chloramine, the ammonia, if you don't have the two-stage, does the RO get that out, or it just taxes the system and then it gets...
It will affect the membrane life.
It will.
Yeah.
So it shortens it significantly.
Yeah. That's why, I mean, a little, trying to cut corners in the beginning, I get it if it's about money, but in the scheme of things, in an average brewery, it might be $500 to have an extra carbon tank. And, you know, maybe you use it 5 times a year, but those membranes are $200 or $300 each time you replace them. So, and there's one thing I forgot to mention. I don't always go by the script. I sometimes get off track, but RO systems, just want to give you a little RO 101 here on sizing RO systems. I know a lot of you rate your systems in barrels, and I can't wrap my head around that. Ian does, but I don't. I'm thinking gallons. If you buy, I'll give you an example. Andy Meyer, 2D Brewery, 5 years ago, we went in and gave him an estimate for he wanted an RO system. He wanted a softener. He softened the whole brewery, carbon filter, and all that stuff. He called us back and said, you guys are the highest bid. Okay, well, let's look at it. So we looked at it, and everybody else was bidding 1,000 or 1,500 gallon a day RO system. And our system was a 4,000 gallon a day. And he says, I'm not gonna need that. And I sat down with him and we talked about why you might need that. See, if a system's rated at 1,000 gallons a day, that means if it runs 24/7 and the water temperature is 77 degrees, which it usually isn't around here, it's going to give 1,000 gallons a day. But if it's 52 degrees, which sometimes it is in the winter, it's going to cut that production in half. So that 1,000 gallon a day is going to be a 500 gallon a day if it runs 24 hours a day. And you can see what that's going to do to the longevity of the system having to run 24 hours a day. Long story short, Andy bought the 4,000, and within 90 days he called me and said, you know, if I'd bought the 1,500 gallon a day, I'd had to turn around and buy another one already. So, I mean, I'm suggesting that if you're going to go in the brewery business and you haven't opened yet, plan on growing. I mean, if you want to start a business, I would think you want to grow that business. And if you make good beer, people are going to come buy it. If you build it, they will come. And so get a system that's big enough. Even bigger is better. If it only has to run 6 or 8 hours a day, that system's going to last 20, 30 years. We've got a client, one of our biggest clients is Mid-America Clinical Labs right down the street here on Shadeland. And we put that system in 18 years ago. And it's oversized for the building. They run 24/7, 365, and they've never been out of water, ever, because we designed it properly in the beginning. And the devil's in the details. I mean, the devil's in the details of making good beer. But we know how to make good water, and we know what kind of systems are going to last. The second thing is, the last thing, do not buy for your craft beer brewery a RO system that uses a diaphragm pump or a rotary vane pump. Those are not commercial pumps. You want a centrifugal stainless steel pump to operate your craft beer brewery, because otherwise you're going to see replacing those pumps and motors. I see some people replace them 2, 3, 4 times a year, and they're just not made for continuous duty. Our stainless steel centrifugals like we use Goulds, are made to operate and run and work a long time. So, for what it's worth. Okay, I want to thank everybody. I really appreciate it. We had a great time here. I just want to encourage everybody to continue to support the Brewers Guild, and hopefully we can do the same thing again next year.